God is not done with this church yet. God is not done with this church yet. At all of our campuses in the room, God is not done with this church yet. I sense it, I see it, I believe it. It's why I'm here. I'm excited to be a part of what God is doing in this place at this time in history. This is an exciting place to be. Praise God for the hope that we have in Jesus. The Lord will do amazing things among you, is what Joshua said to the Israelite people in chapter 3. If you were with us last week, we started a new series called Courage Calling. And it's about God who took this young leader and said, I've got a big call on your life. I want you to take 2 million people and inhabit 300,000 square miles of land. And it's a big deal. And you're going to have courage. And you're going to have to be strong and courageous in this thing. And that's what we talked about last week. And as we go into chapter 3 today, the Lord will do amazing things among you, Joshua says to the people. He's convinced of it. He's excited about it. The Lord will do amazing things among you. But stop and think about who he's saying that to. He is saying that to the Israelite people who grew up hearing their parents talk about, you're not gonna believe this, when you were a little kid, like you weren't even born yet, but God did this amazing thing. We came out of Egypt, there were 10 plagues. Let me tell you what they were, and 1, and 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, all the way up to 10. And then we got out of there, and we got backed up against the Red Sea. And it just looked like there was no way, but God made a way, and he parted the Red Sea, and we walked through it on dry ground. You wouldn't believe it. And then they grew up hearing about pillars of fire at night and pillars of cloud by day. Some of them probably could remember seeing that as they grew up. They were watching that as they grew up. This was normal for them. They got to see manna from heaven every day, quail from God every day. They got to see, when they got thirsty, water miraculously flow from a rock. These are the people that Joshua is looking at and saying, hey, God's gonna do amazing things among you. I mean, goodness, all those things were normal for them. That's what they grew up, that's what they were used to. So you can just imagine what they were imagining. The Lord will do amazing things among you. We're gonna see over the next couple of weeks. One of the amazing things is that God helps them conquer Jericho without ever having to fire a shot. It's an amazing, miraculous battle that God wins. We're gonna see that at one point in a battle, God actually has the sun stand still. I don't know how that makes sense, but miraculously, the whole universe just pauses for a time. God will do amazing things among you, and he's speaking it to a people who have already seen some amazing things. And I wonder if that verse applies at all for us. I wonder if God, as he looks at you and looks at me and looks at us as a church, at all of our campuses, and says, God's gonna do amazing things among you. Can we just stop for a second and realize all the amazing things that God has done already? Yeah. God has built, I mean, you can't look at this church and not see God's hand on it. You can't look at it and go, well, that was because somebody was smart enough, or that was because somebody was talented enough, or that was because somebody, no, it's way bigger than any one person, it's way bigger than any group of people. Like God did it, and he did it through you. It's an amazing thing that God has done. And you sit in these seats and you realize, my goodness, God has saved marriages in this place. God has freed people from addiction in this place. God has used this place all over the world. God has done amazing things. And so when God says, through, I believe, the person of Joshua, the Lord will do amazing things among you. What sorts of things do you imagine? What sorts of things do you imagine for this church? What sorts of things do you imagine for your family? God will do amazing things among you. What sorts of things do you imagine for yourself? Now hold on to that as we start reading chapter 3, because what we're gonna see in chapter 3 is Joshua and the people cross over into the promised land. And we're gonna see how that begins to happen, these amazing things. Verse 1, early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim. Now what you need to understand about Shittim is that it is technically in the promised land. Shittim is on the east side of the Jordan River. It is technically a part of the land that God promised to the people, but it's not in the good part. It's in the part that's kind of dry and desolate and sort of a wasteland. And so when you think about the people being in Shittim and then wanting to cross over, they're not quite in the wilderness where they were. And they're certainly not in the slavery in Egypt. They're not in the wilderness. They're not where they were, but they're not yet where they want to be. It's this sort of in-between land. It's this sort of awkward, uncomfortable, temporary place where God calls us to be faithful while we are waiting for the amazing things, for the promises to really be realized among us. And the truth is, every one of us at some point in our lives will find ourselves in the land of Shittim, this in-between land. It's that land in between where you look at your family and say, we're gonna get our finances under control. And so we cut up the credit cards and we sign up for Good Sense or Financial Peace or whatever we're gonna do. And we're determined and we get out of the blocks and we're all excited and we're not where we were. But we realize it's gonna take a few years for us to get where we wanna be. It's a time where we sign the papers on the deal. And we're not where we were because it took some effort to be able to even get to this point, but we're not gonna see the benefits, the fruits, the profits, the whatever it's gonna be. We're not gonna see that for a few years. And so there's just gonna be this time in between. We're not where we were, but we're not quite where we want to be. For if you're a college student, young person, it's that time after graduation, but you haven't quite gotten that new career yet, so you're working at Target and in your parents' basement, you know? Kind of living there, and you're not where you were, but you're not quite where you want to be. Verse 1 says, early in the morning, Joshua and all the Israelites set out from Shittim, and they went to the Jordan where they camped before crossing over. Now in verse 15, we see that the Jordan River is at flood stage. We can go study it today. When the Jordan River's at flood stage, it's 100 feet wide. It's 50 times wider than normal. It's 100 times scarier than normal. The water is traveling at speeds of like 40 miles per hour. And I would just imagine that Joshua, being maybe familiar with this, is kind of going, seriously, God? This is the time that you want us to cross over the Jordan? This doesn't make a lot of sense. I could imagine him questioning God's perspective, God's timing, God's running of the universe. And I would ask you, has there ever been a time where you've sort of said, God, really? Like, is this really the time? Is your timing right? Is your perspective right? Is this really the situation that you're calling us to? I just don't know how I feel about this. Wayne Smith is a beloved pastor when I was living in Lexington. He had built a mega church before anyone called it a mega church. And when he found out from his doctors that he was gonna have to go get his heart catheterized, and it was really sort of exploratory to find out whether or not his issues were gonna be able to be dealt with medication, or if they were gonna have to do bypass surgery. There were 52 people that met in St. Joseph's Chapel, the hospital there, and they prayed from his church. They prayed, oh, dear God, please let it be that he can just have medication and not have to go through this bypass surgery. And sure enough, when the doctors got in, they said, no, he's gonna need bypass surgery. They went and they did the surgery, but when they opened him up, they found that there was it was a very rare birth defect in the pericardium, the sac around the heart. There was actually a hole, and his heart was slowly slipping down through the hole. It's a very rare condition. There are only 363 other cases of this happening, and they were all discovered in post-mortem. And what they realized is that the doctors would never have found that condition and saved his life had they not had to go in and do the bypass surgery. See, I think there are times in our life that we want to question God and we want to say, hey, God, I don't know if your perspective is right on this. I don't know if you've got the wisdom on this. I don't know if your timing is right on this. But then we discover that God sometimes is giving us what we think is a setback when it's really just a setup, because God doesn't want to just show up, he wants to show off. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes in my life, I feel like God doesn't want to just show up, he wants to show off. Well, after 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp. They're looking at this river at flood stage. It's very intimidating. It's very scary. They went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. Hey, if you want to see God do amazing things, here's my first point: put God first. Put God first. The Ark of the Covenant was basically considered the presence of God. Inside the ark, there was the golden container of manna. There was Aaron's staff, his rod. There was the tablets. They believed that the tablets where the 10 Commandments were originally put on. And this is the Ark of the Covenant. And Joshua is saying, or God is saying through Joshua, we're going to put the Ark of the Covenant first. That's what we're going to do. Now understand, this is not a sightseeing trip. This is not even just a crossing over some river trip. This is like an invasion into a new land. And what Joshua says is, we're gonna put the religious leaders, the priests, we're gonna put the religious leaders with the ark. We're gonna let them be the force that goes in first. And oh, by the way, we're gonna take 2,000 cubits between them and all the rest of us. That is about 1,000 yards. Think 10 football fields. That we're gonna put the religious leaders out first. We're all gonna stay back 2,000 cubits. Now, I don't know if you've met a lot of religious leaders, but as one, I would tell you that we're not always the toughest, okay? Like, you don't always think of the pastors when you think, hey, let's put a special Green Beret force together to invade a land. Go get the pastors, right? I mean, most of the time, the only thing we kill is like a plate of wings, okay? So these people are saying, let's put the toughest guys. And the truth is, like, later on you find out they actually had a group called the Mighty Men of Valor. Wouldn't you put them first? But Joshua is laying out this plan. God is having Joshua lay out this plan where we're putting God first. It may not always make sense. But if you want to see God do amazing things, well, then you put God first. You want to see God do amazing things in your marriage? Then put God first. We'll talk about marriage like it's a triangle relationship, the guy and the girl and God at the top. And if we'll just put God first and work on growing toward God, inevitably we grow toward each other. Put God first in your marriage. Put God first in your decision making. Let God have first place in every decision. We talked about that last week. Like, as we're trying to figure out our call, as we're trying to figure out what God is asking us to do, what his will is for our life, the first question we can ask is it biblical? Right? So put God first in every decision. Give him the first place in every decision. Give him the first day of every week. Come and worship him. Give him the first hour of every day. Get up, read your Bible, pray. Give him the first page, or give him the first check of the month. Honor him with your finances. Like, put God in every area of your life. Put God first. I think Jesus said it. He said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And then all these other things will be added to you as well. Put God first. Another way you can put God first, in verse 5 it says this, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves. Now what that means is, back then they would have these ceremonial washings where they would say, we want to purify ourselves, we want to be right with God, we want to take everything and make ourselves sort of set apart, and so we will consecrate, we will purify. And it occurs to me that if we want to see God do amazing things in our life, that we ought to be doing that same thing. If there's some area of our life that just doesn't line up with what God is calling us to do, then we need to stop doing that. Or if there's some great thing that we know God is calling us to do, yet we have not obeyed him in walking into that, well, then we need to consecrate ourselves. We need to set ourselves apart. We need to begin to obey God in that area. For tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. Consecrate yourselves. Joshua said to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. And so they took it up and they went ahead of him. So notice this, right at the end, they took it up and they went ahead of him. Notice that no one has told them how this is going to happen. At this point, he said, take the Ark, march, and they have no clue how they're gonna cross. Are there rafts? How is it we can't obviously just walk across this incredible deluge of water? So what is going to happen? God doesn't tell them how. And in verse 7, and the Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, and so that they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. You tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river. Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Phliakites, the Pickophites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. And now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And then verse 13. As soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, they set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap. Do you understand? They are already moving before God shows them how. It's as if God is trying to say, you know what, let's worry about the who is gonna do this, not so much about the how it's going to happen. The Lord, the Lord, the Lord your God, the Lord your God. That's what's mentioned way more than the how it's going to happen. It's the who. And they're moving before they even know how it's going to happen. That's my second takeaway. If you wanna see God do amazing things, then take step number one, even if God hasn't shown you step number two. Does that make sense? Even if God hasn't shown you step number two or how it's going to happen, you still obey him in step number one. Hey, if you're a millennial in the room, would you just raise your hand? At all of our campuses, if you're a millennial in the room or Gen Z, just kind of raise your hand. Don't be shy. I'm not going to ask you to public speak or anything. Yes, can I just say I love you. Your generation is going to change the world. You care about things in a way that is so passionate. You all are going to change the world. But I need to address you and tell you something. When the rest of us would want to go on a trip, way before cell phones, we had this thing called a Rand McNally map. It was an atlas. Do you remember this? It was so old, so long ago. But we would take, and what we would do you remember this? If you were gonna take like a multi-state trip or whatever, you would take out the Rand McNally and you would take the old yellow highlighter. And you would map out like every turn and you would go, oh, and in that city we'll stop for gas, and then over there we'll stop for the night, and then we'll stop for the food. And we planned out the entire trip before we ever got in the car. But what do we do now? Now we got Siri, folks. We don't need the Rand McNally anymore. We've got Siri, or we've got maps. I mean, I don't know if you like maps. I like maps. I think maps is really cool. They'll have like celebrity voices. Like you can get your instructions auto-tuned by T-Pain, you know, coming at you. Or you can get, they had Shaq do the voices on Waze. Like, be careful up ahead, there's a Shaqcident. Like he would do that on there. But you got Waze, you got Siri. But here's what we do with Siri. We program where we want to go, and then we just sit it right there. And Siri doesn't take this whole trip, it takes this whole trip and show it to us. No, it just zooms down to this little blue line. This little blue line of hope. This little blue line, and then it will tell us the very next turn. That's all it tells you. It's all it shows you. And it doesn't tell you how you're gonna eat, and it doesn't tell you, in fact, if you wanna eat, what do? You punch another button, you say, I'm hungry, Siri, and it goes, oh, I'll meet that need for you, right? And we do that. And some of us will trust Siri with turn-by-turn directions for our life. Some of us are trusting Siri more than we trust God. Because what we do with God is we say, okay, I'll think about going to a small group, God, but here's what I'm gonna need you to do for me, okay? I'm gonna need you to show me exactly how me doing that is gonna help my business, it's gonna help my marriage. I'm gonna need you to spell out for me every way that that's gonna help me out. And then I'll kind of take a step back and see if I like your plan or not. Some of us would say, hey, God, you know what? I will. I'll go to a counselor, but first you're gonna need to tell me, like, can I trust this? Is this process gonna help me? I need to know exactly how, okay, God, you're telling me to call someone and reconcile a relationship. But first, I need absolute assurance that that person is gonna forgive me. I need absolute assurance that that's not gonna spill out into other places in my life. And I'm just gonna need you to show me exactly how this is gonna happen. God, okay, I see what you're wanting me to do. You're wanting me to do some foster care or help out in that area of the world. But you know, God, there's some risks to that, so here's what I'm gonna need you to do. I'm gonna need you to show me exactly how. Do you see the ludicrousy of that? Do you see God standing up here and going, you're trusting Siri more than you trust me? Just take the clear next step that I'm calling you to. What step is God calling you to take next? What is the very next step in your call? What is the very next step when you want to see God do amazing things in your life? What is the very next step? Truett Cathy, who started Chick-fil-A and ran Chick-fil-A and grew Chick-fil-A, he was a Christian and he discipled people. One of the things he did was he discipled. A young man came into his office one day and Truett realized this kid needed a car, but even more than a car, he needed discipling. And so what he did was he took Dr. Stanley, Charles Stanley's tapes, old cassette tapes. Hey, millennials, cassette tapes are these things that, okay. So he took these Dr. Charles Stanley cassette tapes, and what he did was at the very end of the series, he recorded himself saying, the keys to your new car are in my office. Come find me for your new car. And he just gave him the cassette tapes. A couple days later, he said, boy, are you getting discipled? Are you listening to the tape? Well, not yet. A couple weeks go by. Just kept checking in with him over and over and over. And finally, didn't hear anything from the boy, called him into his office, and he said, I want to play something for you. Give me that last cassette tape. And he put it in there, and the boy heard it, and the boy just went, and Truett was very tempted to shortcut the process and give that boy a car, but he gave him something that much more valuable. The lesson that sometimes you need to move to get the miracle. That sometimes God is asking you to move before he blesses you with the miracle. I confess to you, church, that there have been times in my life when I am crying out to God, sometimes frustrated, sometimes shaking fists, sometimes going, God, why don't you do this in my life? And in retrospect, I realized that as I was shaking my fist at God, that God was up in heaven going, I'm just waiting on you. I'm just waiting on you to grow, to make the move, to take that first step. Verse 17. They begin to take this first step. Verse 17, the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. Is this reminiscent of any other miracle to you? The Red Sea? I sometimes think God looks at us and says, you know what? I'm ready to do some of the same things I've done in the past. You just need to do some of the same things that they did. I look at what God did in the New Testament. Did you ever, like, as you were growing up or as you were kind of getting new to the faith and kind of testing things out, did you ever say, well, God, why don't you move like you did in the New Testament? God, why don't you do special things or miracles? Or why don't you move? Why don't you show up for people like you did in the New Testament? And in my mind, I'm going, my goodness, we don't do the things that they did in the New Testament sometimes. We're not as devoted as that they are. We're not willing to lay our lives down for God. And God is just saying, move the way they moved, and I'll move the way I moved. Yes, he still wants to do those amazing things. He's just waiting on us. Verse 4 and 5, and he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp where they put them down. If you want to see God do amazing things, I think you put God first. I think you take step number one, even if God hasn't shown you step number two. And then the third thing is you got to remember those amazing things that God does in your midst. When you get to those places in your life where you're like, God, where are you? Or this doesn't make sense, or what, but when God shows up in your life, you need to remember him. We talked about that a little bit last week. If you want to have courage, then look in the rear view mirror of your life and you'll see some of those places where God has shown up, and that makes your faith grow. It makes your courage grow. And so it's important for us to be intentional, whether you have a journal or whether you get around people and you tell stories, or whether you read scripture and you use their stories as ways to build your faith. But you have got to see, if you're going to have the faith to do the things, you're going to have to, if you want to see God do amazing things, then you have to remember some of the amazing things that he's done. Now, what they did was so interesting. They took some stones in the river, and this is just where my imagination starts to run. They know they're going to pick a stone, and they know that that stone is going to be a prompter for their kids to say, what was it? What did God do? What is this for? What was it like in the wilderness? And so in my mind, I think to myself, how do you pick that stone? Like, did they pick a really dark stone, like an igneous rock, as a way to say, hey, when we were in the wilderness, like, we just went through some really dark times. I will tell you, there were times when it wasn't just the pillar of fire that we were following. It felt like we were in the fire ourselves. I wonder if maybe they picked up a really rough-edged rock. You know, just a rock with a bunch of rough edges, and because they wanted to be able to remember to tell their kids, hey, listen, when we were in the wilderness, you need to understand, like, our relationships got rocky. Like, the rough edges just started to really poke against some other people. Like, we started to grumble, we complained, we were just really kind of mean to each other. Our marriages got rocky, our relationships got rocky. Maybe that's what they did. And so then I think to myself, if we were gonna pick up a stone to remind ourselves how God has showed up and showed off in our life, I wonder what kind of stones you would pick up. Maybe you would pick up that dark stone that says, man, it feels like I've been through some of the darkest moments of my life. Or maybe you would pick up that really rough-edged stone and say, man, our relationships have been tougher. Or maybe you would pick up this one, that like the shiny flakes of stone. Because there were times in your life when you thought, you know where I'm gonna get fulfillment, you know where I'm gonna get peace, you know where I'm gonna get security and status and stability. It's gonna be with money. This is actually fool's gold. You know how fool's gold worked. They would pick it up, they would take it in thinking they were rich, and somebody goes, no, you're not rich at all. And often that's what I see in people's lives, that they pick up money and they go, look, we've made it. And they would just realize over time, no, it doesn't fulfill the way that we thought it was gonna fulfill. Maybe you would pick up a dark rock, maybe a rough-edged rock, maybe a shiny rock. Maybe you would pick up a broken rock with pieces gone because of loss in your life. And when your kids come to you and say, what was it like in the wilderness? What was it like following God? You'll say, you know what? There's been incredible loss. But God has always been faithful. Or maybe for you, you would pick up a smooth stone. And you would say, you know what? I started off over here, but over the course of the wilderness and over the course of my life with God, he has smoothed out a lot of the rough edges in my life. And I may not be exactly where I want to be, but I'm not where I was. And you remember God in that way. It reminds me of what Jesus did when he was in that upper room with his disciples. You remember he was with his friends, and he took some bread and he broke it. He gave it to them and he said, this is my body broken for you. And he took the cup and he said, this is my blood poured out for you. And he was giving them a picture. We take communion around here about every 6 weeks. We're not gonna do it today, but I just thought about that picture that Jesus gives us as a way to remember, almost like these memorial stones, as a way for us to constantly, for thousands of years, come around a table. He was giving them a picture of what they were about to see the next day. His body broken on a cross, his blood pouring out, his arms outstretched, saying, I love you this much. And because he was both fully God and fully man, and because he lived a sinless life, his death is eternally significant. 3 days later, he rises from the dead. He overcomes sin and death, and he's able to extend an invitation to you and to me, and to say, if you'll come and follow me and put your faith in me, then your sins can be forgiven and you can live with God forever. Guys, that's the gospel. That's the good news of Jesus, and that invitation is for you today. If you've not yet said yes to Jesus, then I invite you to do that. Come find me, come find Sean after the service, come find maybe somebody that you came with and say, well, how do I do that? And they'll help you make that decision. Maybe your next step with God is to maybe go home today and maybe write out some of the amazing things that he's done in your life as a way to memorialize them, so that years later, we tend to forget so much. Maybe years later, you could look back and say, this is what God did in my life. When the kids come along, you say, kids, look, you can trust him. This is what he did in my life. Maybe your next step with God is to get in a small group. Maybe it's to find a counselor. Maybe for you, it's to love your neighbor. I think Jesus talked about that. Maybe for you, your next step is just to come back next week. Whatever your next step with God is, can we take it together at all of our campuses as a family? Let's stand and sing together.
So grateful we have a God who cared enough to make us promises, so we can take that step after step after step, knowing full well he made that sacrifice. He gave us the path. So let's sing this out together. I put my faith in Jesus. Put my faith in Jesus, my anchor to the ground, my hope and firm foundation. He'll never let me down. I put my faith in Jesus.
Hey, sing it out. Come on.